How's it going, everybody? Want to do a little bit of a break from the tournament reviews. Next video will probably be the Spanish Materia Cup review, but in the meantime, I wanted to go through and I did this a couple times. I missed doing one last set, mostly because when I was going to do one, Travis didn't want to step on any toes, but wanted to kind of sit down and go through the set and kind of do a bit of a set and review. So, for people that don't know, I've done a set review for every set that's come out since I want to say from Nightmares or Opus 19. Last set I partnered with Travis, and we went through every card in the set and tried to kind of predict the viability or how good the cards are. Figured it'd be kind of fun to kind of go back and review how those takes have aged, what cards have done well, what cards have not done well, and kind of go from there. Uh, like going from the top, this Orin's seen a little bit of play. Final Fantasy X has been one of the ways to play four color like good stuff decks. You can use like Buddy gets you access to Yuna and Kimari and Orin as your fire, and like Kimari especially is actually like a really nice backup to have. It enables you to play the Yuna, and like it's kind of been a cool deck to see because like a lot of cards like Opus One, like the Opus One Lene, actually has seen play in the deck and actually been really really good because Mist Dragon is so prevalent right now, or like Amaterasu. It kind of frees up your ability to Mist Dragon if your opponent has a Mist Dragon or Amaterasu of their own. So if you need to counter or something, it makes it a lot easier. And yeah, also just Yuna is very very like solid if you're willing to give up the backup. So seen a bit of play there. This Red Mage saw a little bit of experimentation early on in the set, as has this Ayame. They're both like Ayame less so, like Samurais and like Tenzin in particular, and you kind of need like some number of forward Samurais. She might be a little bit underexplored, but I mean Samurais is just, like it feels relatively restrictive. So I think it just kind of got phased out in favor of just like playing good stuff mono fire, and Tenzin's kind of fallen out of favor. Doesn't help that Cucullin is like the most played card in the game as well, which just is like the worst thing for Tenzin. Angeal, I don't think the jury is out on Angeal. I mean, if it says search for one job soldier, I think the card would probably be better. You could run the Light Cloud, and you could use Angeal as like a backup that gets a forward, that gets a backup in pretty much any element. That also powers up like a pretty decent LB in Zac. But the fact you have to pay on the spot means that you're either paying for a 5 speed backup that cheats out the 2-drop Pod Cloud, which requires you to either be on Earth or run a guard in your deck. And Final Fantasy players are very averse to running Garnets, in part because you draw 2 cards every turn. So the chances of you drawing into the Garnet before the Angeal is live is actually relatively high. There hasn't been a lot of experimentation with Pod Cloud either. Like I really thought we would see a lot more of it, thanks to Zac being printed and like Angeal to help tutor out the Pod Cloud. I actually played that deck at locals not too long ago, and like I went 1-3, but A, it's really fun to play, and B, I think it's kind of underexplored. I wonder if we play in a 2-deck format, if it might actually kind of pop up a little bit more. If some of the staples you wanted to run are in, water, for instance, because that like it's a way of playing a 4-color deck that leaves all of the water staples open if you want to. Uh, Garland has been actually like surprisingly worse than I expected. Not to say that Knights as a deck haven't been incredible, but I thought Garland was kind of the reason to play Knights when they revealed this. Turns out Corilla is just so much better than I thought she was. Quick comment on this cycle. I've literally not seen 1C play outside of Limited. I think that at this point, the standard units almost across the board are so universally strong that these just are kind of like the third or fourth best ones. And the Crystal Chronicles tutor ability actually doesn't matter because even like Mono Wind is phasing out Norstalen more. And Wind is in such a rough place in general, like Wind X decks don't exist as much, in part because Wind doesn't give you any tools to stabilize against aggression except for maybe the Goddess, and people don't like playing that card. So I think that because of that, I think these cards have really struggled to find a home. It's kind of funny because like the Scry, like I know in Magic, for instance, they just released Surveil Lands, and they're like the biggest thing in the game right now, at least for like that I've seen. Like people really love them, and that's kind of what these are. But the scry on like a fetchable scry one drop backup is like it's like decent, but I think it's just like too low impact, especially when you factor in that if you would take damage, the top card of your deck could just go into your damage zone as opposed to being drawn, which I think is the other big thing holding these back from seeing a lot of play. They are just straight power corrupt evokers, so I think that there's like still a non-zero chance that like having a playset of these in foil wouldn't be the worst investment you could make. But I think that's why they've really struggled to see a lot of play. Jekt has been good, but I think that fire, like the one for each fire character you control, has been nice because the goblins exist. But I feel like if this was in almost any other color, it would be so much better. Like if this was a wind card, for instance, I think it would be one of the best cards in the game. But because it's in fire and fire has so much removal already, it just doesn't really push the envelope on mono fire to the degree that I think I really expected it to. Not that it's a bad card by any means, but it isn't like the thing making mono fire playable. That really belongs to like Montleonis. Maybe if the fire backup engines just get better, or like we get like better Agito cadets from you to search in fire, he could actually like start to kind of crop up and be even better. But like for now, he's kind of like a niche tech in like you had two of in mono fire. Maybe you play him in like a realm deck because you can get the goblins out anyway for him. Selfie is just a card that I don't really like. She kind of enables like Griever and like the Light Squall, but like the Light Squall is conflicting with the fact that it's printed like a pretty decent Ice Squall, and she's like decent with Cipher, but like there's not a lot of reasons to be on fire if you're playing 13, and if you are, the backup is so important. And backup names in 13 are at a premium as well, so the fact that there's actually like a playable Selfie backup is also like really annoying. I think the card is fine. I really like the art. It's one of my favorites. It's like one of the better Gen Kobayashi artworks, I think. But she really doesn't feel like a legend currently. She feels like she's like a setup piece for some archetype. It feels like they were just kind of lacking the card they wanted to make the Fire Legend in the set. They just kind of threw Selfie in that slot. We'll get to what I think the actual like other Fire Legend is in a second. Falander, I think it's interesting that this didn't even show up in like the Tori Kelly like realm decks. I don't think this card isn't bad by any means, but I do think that it is just a little bit too hard to make work. And I do think this like cycle of monsters has ended up being better than people expected. I don't think people really thought like Piranha, for instance, was going to see a lot of play when the set like first revealed. Going through this further. Minwoo, I think, is unironically like one of the best cards of the set. I think there's an argument that we are not playing this card enough. There is, I think, a case to be made that she should be played. Like you could play Refia Control with her, and people just aren't. I think the two modes are incredibly powerful. She pairs so well with cards that like cantripy spells. I think if you're in like water and fire, you could run stuff like Belias or Brynhildr and just get a lot of mileage out of this card in a way that like makes her free and a removal spell, and also gets you to like the point where she's a must-kill threat because if you don't kill her, she's going to wipe the field next turn. I really think this card is just like kind of underplayed, and I don't really know why. And I guess I know why. Like deck space is so tight that what do you cut to make room for this? But like for instance, if you ran a water fire deck and you ran Belias plus Poo Poo, let's say, right? You could go cast Belias with a card in hand. If you have like you can go Minwoo Belias. While the Belias is on the stack targeting the Minwoo, you can then cast a Poo Poo, discard 0, draw 2, draw off the Belias. Now she has haste for her 10k ping. Like, that's really, really strong and not difficult to line up at all, right? And we always talk about how, like, EX bursts and Troyu card are so powerful right now because of the way they like to stabilize against decks like Knights. And that's, like, a lot of EX bursts on a board wipe that's very, very efficient and has, like, further repeated value if your opponent doesn't deal with her. Like, it's extra copies of Chaos or Arc or Refia, like so many like really, really strong cards. Like there's really an argument this card should be played in any deck that's playing Fire right now. Similarly, Lilith, I mentioned it was a job Knight and it gained a crystal. All of that ended up being like Not bad. Kind of fun seeing a little common like this see play. Going through a little bit further here, Ice Bomb I think is held back mostly by the fact that like Ice just isn't looking to play monsters right now. I think there's still a world where like you could add this to a deck like on damage 3, you can get it out of the deck with Realm, but like then you're like just kind of doing things awkwardly. I mean like the on attack Dole and Frieza forward is actually very very strong and I think kind of underrated for an evasive forward like this. But it does have to actually survive that attack, and for that to happen, you really need Realm to be getting you other things, I feel like. So it just kind of is like the 4th best one-drop monster you can run. I really like Valade as like a card concept, but it does mean you have to kind of line up extra things, and you kind of like end up playing bad cards to enable Valade rather than the other way around. I just think that Ice isn't looking for an effect like this, unfortunately. There's just not enough unconditional ping in Ice that can enable this. So there's like a backup in Ice that you could tap to do 1k to a forward, and then like Valade is like pay 2, kill anything. But even that like isn't amazing, right? Like you'd have to be like both tutorable. Emina, I mean, this card is still wildly good. Mostly just held back by the fact that no Ice deck is playing backups right now. Even Kurasame hasn't been good enough to get them out of this, like, I have to kill you in 4 turns or the game is over anyway. And in those situations, you just don't have the extra 2 CP to get the Emina on the field, especially when considering the way that Ice decks play, which is just attack, 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 attack. There's just not a home for this card yet. I don't doubt that this will be. This is like one of the most, like, you should get 3 copies of this card in foil because she will not be bad. But that is kind of where she's at right now, is that like Ice doesn't have a deck that wants to play backups, which sucks. Like I really don't like that. Like when you start seeing light blue cards on your opponent's side of the field, you're put in this like fight or flight situation effectively. This quest has actually been better than I thought she would be. The name class was really rough on her, but she is very very good in those like all in Cat 8 aggro decks that like kind of do the 13 thing but worse effectively, or like the Knights thing but worse. But like in those decks she is quite good, and I knew a lot of people like in especially the DFW area that like were big category 8 fans. They got a lot of mileage out of her. Bard has similarly seen a lot less play than I expected. I thought that like with Emina existing, but like again there's just not a reason to play backups, which gets us to Kurasame. The biggest problem with Kurasame is like if you want to make Kurasame work, there's like 3 cards in the game that give you like board control and mono ice. So either you have to play this weird like Ice X, like Ice Earth deck where you play only like Tyro and, or we play only like Shantoto and Rydia as your ice back or your Earth backup, so like you have 4 ice backups no matter what. So that you have access to like that was why like Ice Earth was so good, is that like if you're trying to make your opponent discard, they have to commit to the field, but if they commit to the field, the Earth stuff stops them from doing that. Ice's only thing to do that is like running Light Shinryu, and it doesn't really wanting to do that. So Kurasame ends up in this like really awkward spot of doing that, and it's just easier to just like, why I don't need to make them discard 5 if I can make them discard 3 cards on turn 1 before they ever get to play. Really don't like the turbo discard like Ice aggro decks like that. Like again, it just like ends up being this weird situation of like, do you have the out to what I'm doing on the top 4 cards of your deck, and if you don't, you kind of just lose. Kurasame maybe was a way to try to push Ice away from that identity, and maybe if Ice ever does, or like if we have you know, something to kind of reduce that in the format, maybe Kurasame could come back into the meta. But there just aren't the tools in Ice to enable a card like this to actually function. Similarly, the Seymour is actually really funny and limited. Remember, somebody got like 6 of these in draft once. It was really funny ever attacking into him because you just got burst like crazy. Yeah, this Squall actually has ended up doing a little bit less than I thought. There's like the trains of like, it allows you to play like Ice Lightning, and the cheat in Selfie is like the big use for him. But the Cat 7 characters, they just you don't have the backup names for this Squall to be effective. I feel like we really need more than just like Sid Kramer, Esper Soldier, and then like maybe you can play a Renoa backup. I will go ahead and say it. I massively overrated the Sephiroth. I don't think the card is bad by any means. I think that like having access to a summon instant like a Giga Wall deck that isn't actually a summon and like is a theoretical hit off of Giga Wall is really powerful. But I also think that that job is filled by a card like Prish more unconditionally, right? I think Sephiroth kind of gets caught in between like being like an okay summon and being like a passable forward. Like that's like what he is. He's like a decent ice summon and like an okay forward the next turn if you wanted to. But again, the goal of ice is never to need the backups for this. Like everything in ice right now is being played at like even cost. Like even like Lufenian is mostly played as just like a 2 CP discard. Like the backup almost matters less outside of like maybe you can discount the cost of a Shiva later on when you push for lethal. And Sephiroth just doesn't fit the mold of like what Ice is doing, so he has to like find his way into other decks. And a lot of those decks, when they're playing Ice plus something else, your removal is just so much stronger than what Ice provides. This wall has ended up seeing a lot less play in Refia than I thought. The biggest reason is that Refia is mostly just trying to survive aggro because the payload of Refia is so strong. And even in like decks that are on Barks, it's hard to find the right quantity of win cards to make Wall a consistent hit that also make him like not really scary to go for. Like the most I've gotten to is like 17 win cards in 4-color Refia. And he still has like an only like an 80% hit chance, and it's disastrous if he whiffs a lot of the time. A lot of these cards, I will say the thing with Win that I really like this set is how good it was in limited. Cards like Epiornis, Enkidu, Sid, Kane, Sosha. These are all really, really good cards in limited. Geomancer as well is like there's only a couple of cards in the set that actually can stop a Geomancer. They kind of just sit there like blue worms, and I think that's like really, really cool. The problem is that like the way Wind is currently being played and constructed doesn't match that design goal. You just can't go for that as a game plan in Wind right now. So these cards end up being like neat for limited, but well below the power curve needed for constructed play. I think like the closest is probably Kane because he kind of does something the first turn he comes into play. This Ranger just makes me mad every time I read him. This whole cycle is like pretty okay, and then there's this guy who just like doesn't have text. It's really bizarre. It's like the only one that breaks him for his first effect, which like Win needs to be building backups and not willing to like pay 3 CP for a delayed removal spell of a forward. Like, and it's restrictive. You can't hit any forward for 5K. Like, why? I'll talk about Chilinko when I get to Yuri a little bit later. Um, Dorgan's kind of funny. I got Mandela affected on this card a little bit. Did you know that he has 3 effects and not 4? I didn't know that. I thought that the draw a card and remove 2 cards from the break from the game were separate effects. I have definitely played this at locals as a, well, I guess I will draw a card and remove your monster from the game, and didn't remove the 2 cards from the break zone. Whoops. um, he really just like it's funny because they try to make him feel like a storm payload, but if he wanted to be a storm payload, I think he needed to cost 3. That way, like you could just like cast him to up your storm count by 1, like for just the 1 CP, and then have the situational extra utility on the other ones. I think that like the fact he's a 4 CP 8K is so damning for the card. It's so difficult for this card to be affected because of it. Um, like the example that I would give is like if you go like Lulu Chocobo as your first 2 casts, if you go Dorgan for your next one, you're still going down on hand size before you get your Rosa reactivation, right? It just ends up being like really hard to time him. So I see him more as like a good stuff card in like win like 4-color decks if they want just like an extra win card to play. But like, is that really enough? I don't know. It's Not Amigo. Like these cards are like really fun. Wind has a couple of these. I think Beldad is actually a card that like should be seeing more consideration than she does. Especially like if people like if you're in a Refia matchup and you know like, hey, I'm making like rainbow colors anyway, and also like Refia is so important to both players' decks. I can remove my opponent's Refia from the game and cast it later on. Like, that's really really cool. Non Amigo is a lot more restrictive on that. Like what deck she's good to be played against. Maybe if we saw a lot more like Poo Poo plus Minwoo, she actually gets better because then she can like I think like Wind would pay for Poo Poo if they could sometimes to like get their storm counts higher. But as is, she's kind of a fun card for a deck that just really isn't very good right now. Bart's is a very strange one. Bart's started off as like this big like threat, and slowly people have started shifting away from him and into just like I'm going to play 18 to 20 backups instead in my Warriors of Light deck, even though, like, in theory, Bart's allows you to do the Sildra thing. And I don't think either one is wrong. I do think that, like, what it boils down to is Refia's game plan is so strong and so comprehensive, you don't actually need the speed of Bart's in a lot of games. And Bart's ends up creating this really big choke point of both needing win cards and being slightly awkward to play the first turn it comes into play because there are no odd-costed Warrior of Light backups. If there was one 3-cost Warrior of Light backup that like drew a card, I think this card would be a lot better. But the problem is that if you go Sarah for him, you don't really get good use out of the Sarah on the first turn that you play the Bard. That you have the Bards, so you like have to find a second backup anyway before you commit to the Bards, and then like it's like turn 3 or 4 anyway, and Bards isn't really giving you that much that you can't hard draw if you're running a large number of backups. And there are no Bards with good EX bursts. So you're running 9 cards in your deck without EX bursts that could have bursts. And that's a bit of a problem. I think this Hope is another card that just is like kind of under experimented with. I know like Reveal 4 out of category 13 is like it seems tricky, but if you ran like a Firewind 13 deck, this card could be okay. Now that said, I don't think this card is going to see much time in the spotlight because of the Legend next set, unfortunately. So even if this deck it does exist and is decent and or playable, I don't really imagine that this is going to be a reason why, unless we like ran multiple card name Hopes. It's kind of unfortunate, just kind of the way the meta is shaken out. That if you want to play like an aggro deck, you're playing Knights, and like 13 hasn't been that in that spot. Similarly, Helena is a card that I think this card is really close to being good. There just isn't a deck that wants to play her. The closest one I can think of is Dissidia. Wants to be playing some number of win cards because Warrior of Light exists. And I think that this effect is really, really powerful. Like, the rate of spending a crystal into the value you gain for it on Helena is, I think, the highest in the entire game. You get 4 CP for 1 crystal, and we value crystals at being about 1.5 CP if you can actually utilize them. So that's really cool. But there just aren't good crystal cards in Wind, and because there aren't, she kind of sits in this awkward space of like, well, you can play the Dragoons to enable her, but then you're creating just dependencies, and even like a card as good as Glaciella is so good because she both feeds herself and is she like feeds herself and is the payoff to herself. Helena doesn't fit that mold. You need to find a deck that's already generating crystals and doing well, and Wind isn't doing that currently. There's just no like I'm playing good cards that are accidentally making crystals so I can run Helena. You have to like go out of your way, and it's not worth it currently in any deck except for, like I said, that Dissidia deck that may or may not exist, just isn't being played or experimented with at all. I've seen a couple like Lilith sets just because Wind is so lacking in EX bursts. It makes sense. I don't think the card is anything crazy good. I think 3 CP for removal on a backup is like honestly too high. I really like 2 CP for like removal on backups. I get that like Lilith scales, but she's so slow to scale that you're dead by the time the burst matters anyway, I feel like. Yeah. Redis doesn't really change what Sky Pirates does, and therefore he's just kind of in this awkward spot of like what Sky Pirates are going to play him, how good is it, does it actually matter? I guess like with this if you're running like Sky Pirate backups with Balthier, you can make Balthier immune to abilities and summons if you play the one drop Fran, but like you still lose to a lot of other issues. So I don't think this is the card that like changes anything crazy with Sky Pirates. Vossler's been really good. Mono Earth has been a really good deck. Vossler hasn't always seen play in it, but Kings have never been better, thanks to Leo's new relevance in the deck. And the fact that there's a King backup that searches a King forward. So you have just like a higher density of Kings that are worth playing in general. Kedar Bashtar. This card is awesome. This is one of the coolest cards in the set, by the way. Just a really fun, thinky card that does a lot of things. It's kind of like amazing how much like reanimator effects or any effect that like revives a forward is just incredibly potent in Final Fantasy. That like forward of low power that like doesn't do anything, remove its on entry ability is still this good. Similarly, I think Guido is a really cool card. One of the first ones of these that I've actually like seen play. I'd like the cannot attack or block, and for good reason. It's not difficult to make this guy draw you like a large number of cards. Gilgamesh, I really just don't like this card very much. I think it's just way too expensive, and it's like almost got like a pseudo maintenance cost with like the pay the extra. I really wonder if this like just cost 5, would it see play like 5 on entry and then like entry and attack, choose a forward monster, break it. It's above rate because we cost break effects usually at about 4.5 with upside. Or like if it's 4 if you can find something else to do it, and 5 for like unconditional break or like relatively unconditional. But this doesn't fit that mold, and because it has this maintenance cost, like you're bleeding out while you're doing this. So I don't know. It's like a one of in some Earth decks, and I really don't think it's even like great in those. Warriors of Darkness as a package is been better than I expected it to be. I didn't really realize how Noct just color fixes them, so you don't actually have to play the lightning with it, which I think has been really cool. It's led to the Earth Wind Warriors of Darkness deck that like helps protect the Noct and like does things in a way that people don't really expect this deck to do. It kind of gives that like retainer package an extra backbone that like really needed to function as a mid-range deck again. And I'm really, really happy for the deck that the deck has seen some play and some success this set, because I don't think they're going to print very many Warriors of Darkness. I don't think this package is ever getting better than it is right now. So if it wasn't playable now, it just never was going to be. It's like the opposite effect of the Golbez from Opus 19, where it's like when they printed that Golbez, it was limited by how good the Archfiends were at the time, but because we expect them to eventually print new Archfiends again, that deck will probably be getting better at some point. Noct has the opposite problem. They don't have that much access to these Warrior of Darkness characters unless they could finally convince 14 to let them print the Warriors of Darkness from that game into this. And I don't know that they're ever going to be allowed to do that. Interesting to note, by the way, that C card is a card with a reanimator effect, but it's so slow and restrictive that it's just not worth playing. Just a weird card in general. Summoner has been a really, really good backup. It's seen a lot of play in Mono Earth. Prish has seen a little bit less play than I thought. Just it basically like Ursula just needs a little bit more than Prish to be good. I think like a couple of like new monk backups, like a monk backup that searches a monk, could really push this archetype back into being like playable. But I think for now it's like just okay. Bilo is great. I really wish that I wish this set they would out of their way to print just a couple of extra night backups, like one in fire and one in water. And the reason why is I think that like because there aren't that many backup targets, especially in the colors that Corilla wants to be playing in, there's this like awkward situation where all Corilla can do is be a stompy aggro card. And I wish that she could be a mid-range like ramp spell, right? Or like a reason to be doing that. And I think that Bilo is like the only card they printed this set, or really since like Opus 5 or 6, that like would like make Corilla consider a mid range game plan. I think it was kind of a bit of a like a whiff on the designer's part. So I'm glad that he exists. I just don't. He's just not enough to enable that by himself. He's like just like a fine backup otherwise. Um, okay, the category 8 stuff. Ultimecia, it's kind of funny that like gaining control of your opponent's forward is such a rare effect that like, especially because we're so used to chaos, but like just saying I want that one and getting that one is a very different style of that effect. She is a little bit slow, and the rate at which like Mist Dragon kind of limits the design space of like if you have this many cards in your breakstone. Even though this deck is very adept at self milling between cards like Axis, Idea, Cipher, she really isn't online until like turn 6 or 7. So the special is really really strong, but you have like the issue again of like, well, how many copies of this are we really running? Adia and Cipher can help enable that a little bit. And in fact, it's nice that like Cipher can like mill her and get her back when she's actually alive. Just hard to find room for 3 of these in those like self mill decks. Similarly, Adia really feels like the legend in this deck. Like this card is so absurd. It's kind of funny. I'm pretty sure she only cost 5 and has the search effect, in part to keep her from being played off of Squall. I'm like 90% convinced that she is just meant to be priced out of Squall's thing for lore reasons, and they had to find some way to recoup the value. And they're like, sure, she can search for a category 8 forward. Like, there's no restrictions. It doesn't have to be like. I would have thought they would have like restricted to like lightning or something. Like maybe that would have made sense lore wise. Like the fact she searches Squall is very funny. And then the removal every turn is really really strong. Just an absurdly good card. Uh, Garuda, this card has been a lot better than I think I really gave it credit for. I like kind of like clocked the niche properly. I just didn't realize how important that niche could be. The like mid range. I don't need a board wipe Shantoto, but like it would be nice to clear the field a little bit. And the way that she interacts with stuff like Knights or with Ice Lightning or like the Mono Ice aggro decks while being very cheap for this type of effect ended up making her a lot better than I think I really thought she was going to be. Cipher is absurd. Easily one of the strongest cards in the set. There's a reason it commanded such an insane price tag on release. Really only held back by the fact that like a lot of the decks that want to play him struggle to find room to play the lightning cards. I think like the mono lightning kind of self mill decks are decent. I think he's like really good in Giga Wall, but like Giga Wall doesn't have room for all the elements it wants to play, so you have to kind of pick and choose. So he gets left out of some of them. I think that like compared to something like Axstar, for instance, it's a little bit like questionable. Like, is this really worth more than Axstar is? If you wanted to leave like Fire out, and yeah, but I mean the card, it has crazy strong text for sure. I didn't really anticipate Diana seeing play outside of Warriors of Darkness. She shows up in a lot of Gigawall lists as like I've heard it described as Lilith set with upside, where it's like being able to dull herself to like dull it forward is just good enough to be worth playing. But then I have to like question like, well, aren't there other cards that could do this? It kind of makes me question like the viability, like the upcoming Kuja, for example. Like I read that like from the LB deck and thought like this doesn't sound particularly good to me. But if Diana's seeing play because like you can cast her to like dull her to dull it forward, maybe Kuja's actually better than giving him credit for it. Just kind of an interesting like thought experiment on this card. Like I wonder if there's other cards similar to this that we're just underrating because there's not like a reason to be experimenting with her. Drace has seen less play than I expected, partly I think just due to kind of Lightning not having a great spot this set, not having a 2-cost forward that like you want to be playing in Lightning. I think the closest is like Lilith. Fujin Raijin. Raijin is obviously absurd. I'm amazed to see that like Fusion isn't just a 3 of any self mill decks. I know that like the argument is that she doesn't do anything by herself, but I think the difference between having Cypher at first strike even matters, and like to the power bump, getting Raijin and Fujin to out of like an 8K cleave matters a lot. It really just kind of boils down to like decks are very good these days, and finding room for a card can be difficult. Um, Going a little bit further, I guess Lulu is kind of the same issue that like a lot of Lightning decks are having. She's just a little even more exacerbated because like she has the dependency of playing summons. I really think this card is better than being given credit for, but I just don't know what plays her right now. I think like a Mono Lightning Chaos Arc, if it existed, would probably be playing a copy of her. You could, like get her with Drace, and she has a way of like turning the large number of summons in the deck into like usable fodder later on, which I think is really really cool. Just like a neat card, just not a broken one or anything like that. Blue Mage actually has seen a bit of play, as has this Agrius. I really didn't expect that, given that like how important Agrius as a name is to Knights. But it turns out that just having a 1-drop that you can always hit with Corilla is nice, and the removal is like fine. It's a Knights is trying to kill you so fast that like the body size doesn't matter nearly as much. Anima is like the one summon in the cycle that I think is going to stand the test of time, and mostly because the effect by itself is really good. If there was like a cheap summon that like if Medine cost 1 and made your opponent draw a card and like wasn't light, didn't have the restriction on it, I think it would see a lot more play. I think Anima fills a similar niche to that. I think that there's like also like a lot of like potential for this card to allow those really slow, low threat decks to have a secondary win condition, which is mill. Um, just a very clean answer. There's so little that stops removed from game. You can like not be broken, not be chosen, but whatever else, which I guess is the big weakness of this. But like if this resolves, there's no recurring the forward. There's no like, oh, it can't be broken. You're not doing damage. You're not bouncing it for them to replay it. It's just gone. It's been very surprising that this Warrior of Light has seen quite as much play as he has. I would think like it reminds me of a card like Pain. It's like a 3 CP forward, and like EX, like it's a backup. Granted, like the standard units in water are so good between Astrologia and Lapret. Even like Blue Mage, if you want to run a forward, the name is really good. But like a lot of people are playing it without the expectation of ever having like the full field bump, right? Which is just kind of like an interesting thing to see. Corilla, I was completely wrong on this card. I did not think again, I was in the mindset of like mid range Knights, are this deck that's like, big bodies, but like builds value with like decentish removal and like so on and so forth. And Corilla does none of that. Corilla is not about like mid range value or like pushing that. Corilla is these like collected company effects like this in Final Fantasy are so much stronger because of how much faster you die in this game than in other games. It feels or like how like even like a 1-drop 3K still does a full point of damage. So like getting 3 bodies onto the field for 5 CP with like any relevant text, which Laswell has very relevant text, it's really difficult to play into and play around. So this is like a pretty big whiff on my part. I just did not see this card doing what it ended up becoming. Siren is a card I think I was actually like pretty close to like spot on with. This card is absurd. I don't know if you people have seen like the Siren Rug deck. The idea being that like if your opponent can't ever choose you, then if they can't get over a 9K first strike Brave, the game is just over effectively. Because you can run enough like protection spells, Mist Dragons, and so forth. Like the only way to like stop this is like an EX burst choosing the Siren. You kind of like create this like aggro prison deck, which is really cool actually. It's a neat deck. Um, This Paladin, I think, is one to kind of like keep an eye on. Again, these reanimator effects are always good. Standard unit support exists, and standard unit backups in water are a dime a dozen that are really, really strong these days. Did not call Piranha being this good. Biggest thing is it's just a very cheap forward that has upside at damage 3. And getting bodies in the field in water is really important because of Tidus. So, really interesting to see that change start to happen. Ferris is, I think, seeing less play than she could, partly because wind water is not a very strong combination for a lot of decks. Like, it really feels like water gives you the glue and then doesn't fit what Ferris needs to enable. Like, you're looking for like almost like a mid-range wind water. You can do like a wind water storm, but that wants more wind backups than water backups. Like, King Tycoon isn't like ideal there sometimes. I mean, having an alternate search target in that isn't Lena is nice, but if you go like Sarah, Tycoon, Lena, you don't want to also have Ferris in the backups a lot of the time. You'd rather have 2 wind backups. And having extra copies of Lena is fine because the special exists. Still a cool card, still really interesting. I think there's a lot of potential for her moving forward because of the name. So I would get at least like 1 copy of her just because, but yeah. Miwa is really, really good. Until this set, there wasn't a single summon that did this, and forwards with back attack are always decent. Right now, she's mostly seeing play in Knights as like a way to like cheese out games with Ramsel. I think she might be a little bit more win more in those situations, but she does win the game when she does that. So I think there's a lot of like interesting things she enables there. This Yuna's a lot better than I thought she would be. I just like saw the name Yuna, and like, why would I ever consider this? Tidus LB is, I think, good enough to make this card worth considering for most decks. I've heard from, I was listening to KP and Ryan Chen. I really trust like Ryan's opinion on mono water more than my own because I am not a good mono water pilot. And he thinks that Yuna just kind of creates too many situations where your opponent can respond and stop you. Um, the example that he gave is that like she has an enter the field ability that like does activate, so you can't go like Yuna then Tidus with no stack. She just said like the card Tidus is reduced by 2. There's like a flat text on the card. Then the second effect should probably be a lot better. Although it does lead to like the funny example he mentioned of like Yuna. They bounced the Yuna in response, and then he played it again and played a 1-cost Tidus. That was like a really funny thing because like this first effect technically stacks. But it has a bit of a Balthier effect where it does create a lot of instances where your opponent can respond potentially. But I do think there's like an argument that this is just like a decent good stuff card that like could go in most water decks going forward. Just has a lot of potential for that in the future. This Lena, I know people like. I dismissed it a little bit on first, like, well, the text is clearly really, really strong, but the name is really, really bad because of the backup. And then I was like, well, the card is really, really strong. And then now I'm kind of at the point like, well, but the name is really, really bad because the backup is so like. The backup usually, I think, draws 3 to 4 cards over the course of the game for me. Between the bursts, between the hitting 2 bursts into damage, and then like also the special being absurd. And that's a lot to give up outside of like very specific decks. I don't think Lena really like covers that bar a lot of the time. A lot of times she ends up being like well, I'll play her in Giga Wall because I don't want to play the 2-cost Lena backup, and she draws me a card if I hit that, like, sure. Like with upside. Kind of like the Diana, except like the draw is the guaranteed part, and like the removal is like less guaranteed. Eden is a card that I think is mostly held back by the lack of good like category 7 or category 8 backups. Again, like Esther Soldier has like been seen like some experimentation to enable this card and just is not worth it. I think this card just like bricks you more than it helps you. Citra, I think, is better than I gave her credit for initially. I was like, oh, you can like. I think the biggest problem with this card that I still like struggle to visualize. I've seen her played in like mono wind storm decks, and I'm like, I don't think those decks can afford to not play Shinryu. And if I'm not playing Shinryu, like what am I doing against like the super wide doesn't take damage boards? And I don't think Citra answers that like consistently enough. I guess like she is 3 CP. Like, she solves so many problems for Mono Wind, except she's light, and that's just like a really big ask to like give up the Shinryu slot in your Mono Wind deck and still play a light card. But I mean, she is kind of like a Lulu in a way. Like the power reduction on casting summons, the ability to loop her with the Chocobo, the ability to just search a Chocobo, and the fact that she's a 3 CP card that does 2 casts. Like she's really, really, really strong. Like strong at what she does. It's just like you're giving up a lot to play this card. Similarly, like Reagan is, if you're playing this card, you're not playing Chaos or you're not playing uh, Gigawall, and I think that like the main thing that you can do with this is probably cheat up Gilgamesh. But like if you're doing the Gilgamesh thing, a lot of the time you should be doing the Gigawall stuff anyway, so you can kind of ramp and like really threaten your opponents. Reagan doesn't do it as effectively. I still think in like self mill decks, he might eventually like find a home. You know, if you the one that comes to mind, you know, are the Don Corneo turbo decks. But yeah, you like run this as a one of as like an extra copy of that. Oh, I've seen him in the in Kieran decks a lot actually. You like I've seen him as an extra copy of Vayne, so you can go like turn 1 Warp a Theodore, and then turn 2 try to go for a Vayne or the Reagan, or like you know basically like play around what your opponent does with their hand, right, and use Reagan as a way to force them to kind of act how you want them to. And in that situation, he's fine. I don't think he's an all-star at what he does, unfortunately. Then we get into limit breaks. I talk a lot about these as like a mechanic as a whole in a different video when I was talking about like Luna Freya, but kind of going over these like real quick. Zach has like been pretty solid. Mont started off as like the best thing in the format, and then people realized that like you have to play Mono Fire to play Zach or Mont, and I don't think people want to play Mono Fire. So he's fallen off like quite a bit over time. I do think that like you could in theory run like a Mono Fire deck with a bunch of removal and potentially beat up on Refia control decks by like just never letting Refia stay on the field. But I think that you're going to struggle to run a deck like Knights out of resources by doing that. So I think that like there's a weird thing, and I'm not the person to tell you how to play Mono Fire in general. Victoria and Surges are both really, really solid. I think Victoria, I think I had a little bit higher in my head than she actually ended up being. But I think it's just kind of I didn't think the condition would be that hard to meet for most ice decks, and it isn't. Ace is about where I had him. I think he's still really solid when he does come up, but I don't think he comes up that often for a lot of wind decks. Yuri is just a disaster of a card. So when they released these, for as good as a lot of the rares are, I mean, Surges, Mott, Zach, Leo, and I'll count Cloud in this as well. Like the generic, like I'm going to play these limit breaks at like most points in the game and feel decent about them. They all feel really good. And I was like trying to like hypothesize what about Yuri went wrong in the design process. Like what was so powerful about this card that it's limit break 2, it cost 5. And I really think what they wanted to do is they wanted a hasty forward from the LB deck. And they didn't. They felt that like 5 CP haste was just too much. They had, like, or you know, like a 3 CP haster was too much. So they had to like find a way to like enable haste on the card without printing haste on it, which is what the Chilinka is. That must have been like really, really good in testing. And Final Fantasy players are just not willing to engage with it at all. The Chilinka is atrocious by herself, and Yuri isn't a reason to play her. Like this doesn't solve any of the issues that Wind has as an element. It doesn't enable what Wind wants to do. It doesn't push Wind forward. And Wind X doesn't want this either because Wind X gets access to any of these. Like I have seen mono Wind decks not play Yuri. Like literally playing like a copy of Leo, a copy of Cloud, and a copy of like Victoria or Zac. In case the Dane steals a backup and plays it because they're so unlikely to ever actually cast a Yuri. It's like, well, I'm going to cast Ace twice or like Alila if I need to. That's how bad this card is. despite how pushed some of these other LBs are. Just wow, what were they thinking? Um, yeah, Shantoto, I kind of started coming around on a little bit. I think that like the ability to remove monsters at any point in a game could be it can be like really game determinative. Giving that access to most decks is really cool, and I think that like she doesn't do as well against aggro as I would have hoped, but I do think that you can enable this card in slower control games against this Mono Earth deck, like those Mono Earth monster decks that are just like stacking 8 million characters for Hippocampos, for example. The only like scary thing about those matchups is that sometimes those monsters can just like kill you before Shantoto is live. But I like that she exists and what she does for the game. Similarly, like I really like Cloud's ability to kind of be an anti-aggro card, and they had a bit of foresight with Cloud that they didn't have with Victoria, which is that Cloud is not answered by another copy of Cloud. So he ends up slowing the game down, which I didn't think he would do. I thought he would accelerate it because Cloud is a forward, so he can do damage, and he can break little like chump blockers. But it turns out that like because Cloud can't answer himself, a lot of times he's a 2 CP 8K that kills one of the forwards that's going to kill you, and your opponent doesn't go to their limit break deck to answer the Cloud. Really like powerful card. I'm happy he exists because of the effect that he's had in the format. I really don't think there'd be a lot of answers to aggro if Cloud didn't exist. Tidus, it's funny how when I first read Tidus, my expectations were sky high, and then we started playing a little bit. Even in pre-release, I thought the card was incredible, and then the first like couple weeks of the format, I was like, man, Tidus really is not that good. And now I think Tidus is like the win condition of like multiple decks. The Earth deck, Mono Earth decks, Tidus is like one of the win cons of it. And not even like the existence of Tidus, like the threat of Tidus forces your opponent to play in really awkward ways against like the Mono Earth Chaos Arc deck. And I think that like that's the real value that Tidus provides that deck. I think that Refia Control having access to Tidus from the LB deck gives that deck a secondary win condition beyond sticking the Refia. Like once they stick the Refia and stabilize, Tidus gives them a way to close the game out, which I think the deck like desperately needed. It's one of the big reasons the deck is so strong right now. And then Leo should not have been printed with this text. Leo should have drawn when he left the field, not when he entered. One of the things I think I was more wrong on than right is Leela. I really appreciate her existence because Sid Randell exists. I don't know if she was like designed to answer Sid Randell, but the fact that every deck has a relatively cheap and fair way to deal with Sid Randell is just nice. That's all. Like she's not an all-star. She's not. I think when I was evaluating her with Travis, I didn't realize how much better the average card in your hand in your deck was than Leela, which is why she doesn't see that much play outside of answering Sid Randell. But I think she's a really good baseline of like, well, no matter what, at least you have this. If you need like something to remove a threat like in 2 turns. One last thing. Lightning probably should have been like LB1 costing 5. Just because it's a little annoying that like if you're playing a mono lightning deck, you can go 3 Leela, 2 Clouds, 2 Lightnings. I guess Earth sort of has a little bit of it because Shantoto is 7, so if you go 1 Shantoto, 3 Mots, 3 Leelas, you still have 1 extra LB slot that has to be filled with something else. But Earth has a lot easier time using the other elements. Like mono lightning, it's like, well, if you're playing Alpha, run a Zach. It's kind of like what it's become at this point. I'm looking forward to seeing what like the hero wind like the 2 new wind LBs, see if those can like help wind as an archetype in a way that Yuri just isn't capable of. I'm excited to see like what the Legend Earth Limit Break does. We've seen the Legend Lightning and Ice ones, and seeing how like they're really trying to push mono for the Legends, which is kind of an interesting concept. I actually like that. I think that everybody plays 4-color Warrior of Light, and if you're playing 2 elements, you should probably like stretch for 4 to play Warrior of Light is like very frustrating. So I think that like they need to be pushing mono as a design to keep mono relevant and keep people from being 4-color good stuff piles with the sheer number of like fetchable backups and engines that we have in the game now. And I think that this is a healthy way of doing it. As much as I wish that like Ace did more for like Earth Wind decks than he actually does, for example. I think that was kind of like the little review of what all these cards do. Let me know if you guys want to. Definitely, if you haven't, you want to have some fun. I always like listening to them and seeing how wrong I was or how right I was. Go back and like check the video on Travis's channel. And hopefully, I will see you all in Opus 23. Lots of really fun, shiny cards. Also, if you haven't, go check out my spoiler for Opus 23, talking about that for about a couple minutes and kind of explaining why I'm excited for it. I think it's a really powerful card. I think it's the most powerful spoiler I've ever gotten, which is really exciting. So, yeah, thanks for watching, everybody, and I'll see you all in the next one.